All right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. We've got a great one for you today. We're going to be looking at matriarchies and
Patriarchies.
trying to kind of get to the bottom of what they really are.
Hmm.
Because there's a lot of kind of mythology and I think misconceptions surrounding them.
Yeah, a lot of, I guess you could say, baggage
Yeah.
surrounding the term matriarchy and, what it actually means and whether they've existed and, all of that.
Right. And the listener sent in some really fascinating uh, material excerpts from various texts and articles and things that all touch on this topic of matriarchies.
Yeah.
So we're going to try to kind of, synthesize some of these ideas together and see if we can come to some kind of understanding.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm excited to kind of dive in and see, how these different sources, speak to each other and where they agree and where they disagree and all that good stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's going to be a really interesting deep dive. I mean, just to kind of kick things off, one of the quotes that really caught my eye, from the material that the listener sent in was from Jordan Peterson.
Okay.
And Jordan Peterson says, the idea that women were oppressed throughout history is an appalling theory.
Okay.
And,
Statement.
well, it is a bold statement,
No,
right?
yeah.
And I think, it really kind of, throws down a gauntlet in a way and makes us kind of go, you know, is that true? Because the way that we often talk about, history is in a very kind of, patriarchal framework.
Sure.
And, this kind of challenges that assumption, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely. I think that when you talk about things like male domination and or female oppression right throughout history, I think you always have to be careful about speaking in overly broad strokes. And I think Peterson, to his credit, is trying to challenge that a little bit. Like you can't just look at history and be like, oh yeah, well men were always the oppressors and women were always the oppressed. Like it's much more complicated
They're much more nuanced.
than that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think, he's not necessarily saying that women haven't been oppressed, but I think he's more trying to argue that it's not like a universal truth that every society throughout all of history has been, men oppressing women.
Right. And I think that's an important point to make, right? I mean, it's important to recognize that there's a lot of diversity in terms of how different societies have structured themselves.
Exactly. And, one of the things that the listener sent in that I think really speaks to that is some research from Vanderbilt University about matrilineal societies.
Right.
And just for the listener who may not be, familiar with that term,
Yeah.
when we're talking about matrilineal societies, we're talking about societies where lineage is traced through the mother's side of the family rather than the father's side.
Right. And this is something that, I think a lot of people aren't even aware of, right? I mean, we tend to think of patrilineal societies as being the norm throughout history, but actually,
Yeah.
the research shows that there have been a lot more matrilineal societies than people might think.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the things that the Vanderbilt study, really brought to light was the fact that they analyzed 160 different matrilineal societies.
Wow. Which is
But,
upset.
I think it really challenges the idea that these kinds of societies are rare or, just theoretical constructs. They're not like they exist and they've existed across, various cultures and time periods.
Yeah, it completely changes the picture, doesn't
Mm.
it? When you
Yeah.
think about it like that. And what's even more interesting to me is, yeah, what this research tells us about why some societies shifted away from matrilineal structures.
Okay.
You might think that there would be like one simple explanation for that, like, oh, patriarchy took over or whatever.
Right.
But it's actually way more complicated than that.
Yeah, and that's what makes this research so fascinating, right? Is that they found that there's no single factor that explains this shift. It's not like, there's this one thing that happened and then all of a sudden every matrilineal society was like, oh, we got to go patrilineal now. Like, it's just not that simple.
Right. And they found that, different societies shifted away from matrilineal structures for different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes those reasons were economic. Sometimes they were political.
Yeah.
Sometimes they were social. It really depended on the specific context of the society.
Exactly. And I think one of the things that they did find that was a significant factor in some cases was the introduction of movable and transmissible wealth.
Okay, now what do we mean when we say movable and transmissible wealth?
So basically we're talking about things like, possessions and tools and currency.
Right.
And even like intellectual property in some cases.
Right. So not just land?
Right. not just land, because land, it's kind of fixed. It's there. It's not going anywhere.
Right, it's immovable.
Exactly. But when you have these other forms of wealth that are, easily moved or traded,
Right.
it kind of changes the game a little bit.
Interesting. So how does that tie into the shift away from matrilineal societies?
Well, I think, if you have a society where wealth is primarily based on land, that's passed down through generations,
Mm-hmm.
it might make more sense for lineage to be traced through one line, either maternal or paternal, to kind of simplify inheritance.
Right, to keep it clear.
Exactly. But when you start introducing these other forms of wealth that can be, moved around and traded,
Sorry.
the rules of inheritance can become more flexible, and that can lead to shifts in power dynamics.
I see. So basically you're saying that the introduction of movable wealth could have disrupted the existing systems of inheritance in some matrilineal societies.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not like a direct causal relationship,
Right.
but I think it's definitely something that played a role in some cases.
That's really fascinating because it shows how, economic factors can really influence social structures.
Right. Absolutely. And, speaking of power dynamics, one of the other sources that you sent in that I thought was really interesting was about the role of women in leadership positions throughout history.
Yes.
And, we often hear this narrative that women were always excluded from positions of power, but that's simply not true.
Right. And I think, one of the examples that really challenges that narrative is the story of the three powerful queens who ruled and defended Egypt against invaders in the 16th century BC.
Yeah. I mean, talk about powerful women. These queens weren't just figureheads. They were actually wielding real authority.
They were making decisions.
They were leading armies.
They were defending their kingdom.
Exactly. I mean, they were doing everything that a male ruler would have done and doing it successfully.
Right. And this wasn't just an isolated incident either. I mean, there are lots of examples throughout history of women holding positions of power in different societies.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not like it was the norm everywhere.
Right.
But it definitely happened more often than I think a lot of people realize.
Yeah, it really makes you question the assumption that powerful women are the exception rather than the rule.
Totally. And, all of this kind of leads us to the big question at the heart of this whole deep dive.
Well, it is.
What is matriarchy?
Right. I mean, it's a word that gets thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean?
Exactly. And I think, to really understand that, we have to go back a little bit in history.
All right.
So back in the 1600s, there was a scholar named Sir Robert Filmer,
Okay.
and he defined patriarchy as the rule of the father over the family
Okay.
and the rule of the king over the state.
Okay, so basically the father figure in charge of both the family and the society.
Exactly. And so for a long time, people have been trying to define matriarchy as kind of the opposite of that, right?
So flip the script.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like women rule the family, women rule the state.
Okay. So kind of like a mirror image of patriarchy.
Exactly. But the thing is, anthropologists have argued that this kind of mirrored structure where women rule absolutely and men are universally subordinate is actually pretty rare, if not non-existent, in real-world societies.
Wow. So basically we're saying that this kind of pure idealized version of matriarchy, where women have all the power and men have none,
Yeah,
probably never actually existed.
probably not.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and it kind of raises the question of, okay, if that's not what matriarchy is, then what is it?
Right. I mean, if it's not just the opposite of patriarchy, what are we even talking about?
And this is where things get really interesting, because what we often see in matrilineal societies isn't necessarily female dominance,
Okay.
but rather a more complex system of shared power.
Shared power.
Yeah. Like women and men have distinct roles and spheres of influence,
Okay.
and these roles can shift and adapt depending on the circumstances.
I see. So it's not about one gender having all the power.
Right.
It's about a more dynamic interplay of power and influence between genders.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes studying these societies so valuable, because they challenge us to think beyond these simplistic binaries.
Right. Like it's not just men versus women.
Yeah.
There's a whole spectrum of ways that power can be shared and distributed.
Totally. And I think, that's something that we can learn a lot from as we think about, how to create more just and equitable societies today.
Absolutely. And I think, after looking at all of this material and having this conversation,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like the concept of matriarchy, as it's often imagined,
Right.
might not have been the dominant model throughout history,
Right.
but matrilineal societies with their diverse power structures
Yeah.
definitely challenge, the simple narrative that we often hear about, historical gender roles.
Yeah. And it's really, I think it's a call to to look deeper,
Yeah,
to not just accept the simple answers, but to really dig in and understand the complexities of how different societies have functioned throughout history.
totally. So to all our listeners out there, keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and don't be afraid to think for yourselves.